Good morning. In June, I attended the Australian Local Government Association conference here in Canberra, and there I announced the latest round of Regional Development Australia funding grants. These grants are for local community infrastructure. They've been particularly effective because they're based upon local priorities determined by elected local councils. At that conference, I announced funding that was included in the budget for community infrastructure grants to every local government area in Australia. That was, of course, a bipartisan conference. You had National Party and Liberal Party shadow ministers then attending the conference and, of course, expressing their support for local government and for funding of community infrastructure. In recent days, Warren Truss, the new minister, has revealed that contrary to all of the rhetoric prior to the election, what they will do is cut the grants that were made to local councils. Local councils had to put in their submissions of between $30,000 and up to $2 million, depending upon the size of the council, to the department for its approval of these community infrastructure grants. This is particularly important in regional Australia, where this local community grants program has ensured that jobs are created, that there's a multiplier effect because local government source contractors in their local communities, and that there's major benefit to these local communities. Tony Abbott is already running a razor through local communities. Tony Abbott is making cuts continually throughout the impact, particularly on regions. Before the election, I used to refer to Tony Abbott and his team as the no-alition. Well, it seems now that they're in government, they're still saying no. They're saying no to jobs, they're saying no to community infrastructure, they're saying no to regional communities, they're saying no to local government. This is a real concern and comes on top of course, the winding back of the national broadband network, where hundreds of thousands of Australians who were due to get the national broadband network have suddenly disappeared off the agenda. Prior to the election there, the coalition said that they would honour all existing contracts. After the election, that is also disappearing. Joe Hockey has had something to say again before the election and after the election. Before the election, they spoke about the economic crisis. We don't hear about economic emergencies and fiscal crisis anymore. What we hear from Joe Hockey is the need for job creation and discussion about major infrastructure. Well, if you are cutting back on the national broadband network, if you're cutting back on local community infrastructure grants, these are precisely the programs that will create jobs in the short term while providing major economic benefit and boost to productivity in the longer term. This is an opposition that's come into government but hasn't learnt yet that they need to actually govern, not just continue to say no to everything. Happy to take questions.
Sure, Cabinet today is supposed to be discussing Labor's position on the carbon tax whether to support the repeal of the legislation. Are you worried there'll be any kind of backlash from the left of the party, which has been worried about Labor basically backing down on its position?
No, because media speculation isn't accurate there. Labor's position on climate change is very clear. Labor believes that climate change is real. Labor accepts the science on climate change. Labor knows that we need to act, and Labor knows that a market-based mechanism is the cheapest way of reducing our emissions. Any response that we have to the government legislation will be consistent with those principles. We don't believe that climate change finished on September 7. We believe that this is a fundamental issue for this and for future generations. And in terms of our response to specific legislation, it will be consistent with our principal position. Everyone has made that very clear, from the climate change spokesperson to was a bit of an issue during another ballot that was held recently. and both myself and Bill Shorten made our positions very clear.
What will Labor do then in Parliament, and is splitting the bills in the Senate a possibility?
Well, we'll wait and see, and we'll have a meeting, and I'll discuss my views on that. Funnily enough, in the shadow cabinet, rather than outside to the media prior to the shadow cabinet.
But just to clarify, does this mean that Labor would support getting rid of the carbon tax, but still demanding there is some sort of price on carbon in the legislation that comes through by the opposition, by the government?
I'll be making my comments in the shadow cabinet, and we'll make our position clear once those determinations have been made. There are a range of my positions very clear. Climate change is real. We need to act. I supported an emissions trading scheme, and indeed wrote the policy when Kim Beazley was leader, almost last century. This is an issue that's not an issue which changes from day to day. This is an issue in which you need consistency. Labor's position will be consistent.
Do you think it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to put back in place the whole infrastructure around carbon pricing if the carbon tax is rescinded?
Well, you're talking hypotheticals, and I'm not about to go into what might or might not happen in 2 or 3 years' time. What we have is bills before us, like other bills. The opposition, the Labor Party, we will make our collective determination and then pursue that in both the House of Representatives and in the Senate.
Should there be another decision out of Shadow Cabinet today, one way or the other?
That's a matter for the Shadow Cabinet. It's not up to me to preempt it.
Do you welcome the government's decision to lock Huawei out of any contracts to build the NBN?
Oh, look, that's a matter for the government of the day. We certainly had a position when we were in government, and that was based upon sound advice.
Do you think this will affect the free trade negotiations that the government wants to wrap up with China?
Oh, look, that's a matter for those negotiations. I'm certainly not in a position to go into the detail of what's in or out of those negotiations. That's a matter for the Trade Minister.
This thing upsets China a lot. And
Well,
do you think that it will...
Australia's job is to defend our national interest.
Indonesia has recalled Australia's ambassador over allegations we've used the Jakarta embassy as a spy base. What do you think this has done to our relationship with Indonesia?
Oh, look, I think those matters are a matter for the Foreign Affairs Department. I don't think that when it comes to those sort of international questions, they should be the subject of partisan party politics. And so I'll leave that up to the Foreign Minister, who's the appropriate person to respond, Julie Bishop.
What do you make?
New Senate election in Western Australia.
Well, it certainly is an interesting situation in Western Australia. I certainly, await the AEC as an independent body. They should be allowed to undertake their work, and then the High Court is, of course, independent as well. They'll make a determination based upon the facts, whether it's possible that the outcome has been distorted by this 1,400 or whatever the figure is, the vote. So they'll make basically a decision based upon the facts, and people will be bound by it. It's a matter of whether these missing votes actually change the potential outcome or not. I'm certainly not in a position to know that, nor is anyone at this point in time. So I think, as frustrating as it might be, I think these processes have to be allowed to take their course.
What do you... Go on.
Oh, sorry, do you think that Deb O'Neill was the best candidate to replace Bob Carr in the Senate?
I didn't have a vote in that position, so therefore I'm not in a position to comment. That was made by others. Is she a good candidate? Yes, she is a good candidate. But I know that there were other good candidates putting themselves forward as well. I have the utmost respect for Deb O'Neill. I also have the utmost respect for Mike Kelly, and there were other potential candidates there as well.
Should Clive Palmer give an extensive reporting of all his financial interests when he comes into the Parliament in the pecuniary interest register. And do you think that it's possible for an MP to have a conflict of interest on a particular matter? Or do you agree with Clive Palmer that only ministers can have conflicts of interest?
Of course, it is the case that when you're involved in public life, you can have conflicts of interest, whether you're an MP or a minister. So Mr Palmer's got to be cognizant of that fact. I think Clive Palmer's going to be an interesting addition to the House of Representatives. I note that there was a lot of concern, excitement from members of the gallery and members of the then opposition about the nature of the House of Representatives and the Senate makeup last time round. The fact that there were negotiations took place between myself as Leader of the House and other government members and crossbenchers in order to get legislation through. Guess what? That's going to happen in the new Parliament as well. It's happened in most parliaments since Federation, and I just hope there's the same sort of scrutiny that goes on, the same sort of rhetoric. I look forward to Tony Abbott's rhetoric about chaos and towels wagging dogs because he's off negotiating with Clive Palmer in order to get legislation through, because he'll have to negotiate with Clive Palmer, the crossbenchers, the Greens political party, and he might even have to talk to the Labor Party in order to get legislation through, both before and after July 1. That's the nature of our democracy. Clive Palmer has every right to participate as a duly elected member of the House of Representatives. I hope he participates in a fulsome way. I think he could add a bit of character and colour to the chamber. I'd be happy to give him advice about ways of maximising his impact as a former Leader of the House. I look forward to sitting down with him and doing just that.
Are you concerned his financial interests could influence his positions on various pieces of legislation?
I'm not going to preempt that. I think he's entitled to presumption of innocence like everyone else, and that he's entitled to the view that he'll do the right thing, and where there is a conflict of interest on a piece of legislation, then he won't participate in that. I think that's a reasonable thing to expect. But I look forward to Mr Palmer's participation. I, of course, start off with the objective that there should be 150 members of the Labor Party sitting in the House of Representatives. But given that that is not a realistic objective, I think the fact that Mr Palmer's there could make for a more interesting Parliament.
Just going back to Deb O'Neill, Mike Kelly said that it was a decision based on affirmative action. She was from, obviously, the right faction, and New South Wales Right has been criticised for not having enough female candidates in the past. Do you think that this is
I'm
the best
not a member of the New South Wales Right.
I don't
intend to comment on their behalf. I'll leave them to sort out their own responses.
And I just wanted to ask about reports today that Holden is apparently demanding a yearly payment to continue manufacturing cars in Australia. Do you have any response to that?
Oh, look, I think Senator Carr is handling those issues, and no doubt he'll have more to say later today. What I would say is that the motor vehicle industry is an important provider of jobs in Australia. It's not just the direct jobs of people who work at Holden, it's the flow-on impact that it has, and the impact that it has in terms of innovation as well. It's a driver of other jobs in other sectors in the manufacturing area, and that's particularly important. It's important that we have a diverse economy. We can't survive just on the basis of resources and energy. We need support for manufacturing. We need support for smart manufacturing as well, something I've been very interested in the time I was responsible for the National Broadband Network. That's one of the tragedies of stopping the rollout of the NBN, is the impact that it will have on jobs. The NBN's vital for small business, it's vital for smart manufacturing, it's vital for future growth. And I think that the government is being very short-sighted, and I draw people's attention to Tony Abbott's quite extraordinary statements to the Washington Post, which are in line with his statements on climate change, that climate change is crap, where he spoke about somehow support for high-speed broadband done through fibre best technology, this century's technology, as somehow being a wacko policy. I think that anyone with an ounce of knowledge of the communication sector, including in the United States, would be scratching their head that an Australian Prime Minister could make such an ignorant statement about the future. Thank you.